Hello again. One of the difficulties I find in discussing race is that few people actually seem to know all that much about the origins of humanity. They are vaguely aware that early humans emerged from Africa and so assume that those first people to populate Europe and Asia must look very much like modern day Africans, which is to say, black people like the Bantus from West Africa, folk like the Nigerians. Those early humans were, of course, nothing of the kind. Primitive hominids, such as Homo erectus, moved out of Africa and into Asia perhaps 100,000 years ago. There were successive waves of these emigrations from Africa, and some of those early humans evolved in Europe into the Neanderthals and in Asia into Denisovans. Then, modern humans, Homo sapiens, left Africa and colonized the world starting about 70,000 years ago. They bred with both the Neanderthal and the Denisovans. Here is the problem, though, which is caused by ignorance of human history. When people picture early modern humans, Homo sapiens, leaving Africa, they assume that these folk were like the typical modern African, that is to say, black, like people from West Africa. They were nothing of the kind. 70,000 years ago, at the time that that first wave of Homo sapiens left Africa, most of Africa was populated by people like the Khoisan, who have the most ancient human lineage on Earth. The thumbnail to this video shows a Khoisan man. His skin is sallow rather than black, and he has the same epicanthic eye fold as is seen today in people from East Asia. He looks more Chinese than anything else. At the time that modern humans like this left Africa, the dark black people, the Bantus we think of as typical Africans, were living in a small part of West Africa in the rainforest there. And they shared that area with very primitive, archaic human species with whom they interbred for thousands of years. When they began to spread out from West Africa to invade and colonize the rest of the continent, about 5,000 years ago, they exterminated the pygmies and Khoisan with whom they came into contact, and they now occupy almost the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. In white Europeans, a small amount of very useful DNA is found, which has been inherited from the Neanderthals. Although traces of Neanderthal DNA have been found in people living in places such as Ethiopia, this is present in much smaller amounts than in Europeans, and is a result of what is known as backflow. In other words, Homo sapiens had already acquired that Neanderthal DNA, visited Africa, and interbred with those living there. In the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea, this was a consequence of the Sabian Empire, which straddled the Red Sea and had its origins in what is now Yemen. As we move further west into Africa, even these minute amounts of Neanderthal DNA peter out. Instead, the DNA of an earlier and much more primitive human species is found, what is known as a ghost population. The chances are that this was Homo erectus, one of the earliest types of human. We can't be sure about this because, of course, DNA specimens from tens of thousands of years ago simply degrade in the hot and humid conditions of Central Africa and West Africa. So we can't recover them. It's not that we recover the Neanderthal DNA and we've reconstructed the genome of the Neanderthals because these specimens were found in cold, dry places. It is thought that the populations of this early species, the primitive humans, lingered on in Africa, and just as Homo sapiens were mating with the more advanced Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, so too were those in sub-Saharan Africa interbreeding with a very primitive type of human. Up to a fifth of human DNA in some parts of West Africa is from this early type of human. There's confirmation of this from some skulls which have been found in West Africa, for example, that from Iwo in Nigeria. This dates from about 13,000 years ago and shows a mixture of both modern and very primitive features. It looked as though a modern human had been crossed with a primitive species like Homo erectus. All this presents us with an intriguing point, which is that most of this interbreeding seems to have been in that part of West Africa, which is the ancestral home of the Bantu peoples. This is the very location which is the origin of modern populations of the black people who are now living in Europe and the United States. The transatlantic slave trade took people from this area, and the ancestry of all African Americans and Caribbeans lies in that area. What this means is that today in both Britain and America, the population is in the main of white European stock, those whose ancestors inherited useful genes from the Neanderthals, and that they are living side by side with black people whose own genetic heritage is far more ancient and primitive. Whether this has any effect on the behavior and achievements of those modern populations with very different genetic backgrounds is an interesting question. It's hard to see how this could fail to be the case, really. Let me reiterate what we know so there can be no possible misunderstanding. In Europe, everybody has a small amount of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, just a couple of percent at most. This is enough to be very useful, otherwise it would have vanished long ago. In West Africa, people do not have this Neanderthal DNA. Instead, they have a much larger amount, up to a fifth of their genome, of DNA from a primitive, extinct type of human, probably Homo erectus. This means that black Africans are very different from us. Whether that difference can be said to amount to making them a different species is debatable, but that is certainly one way of viewing the case. I will readily concede that this idea is controversial, and by no means all anthropologists subscribe to it. What is not controversial is the presence of this so-called ghost DNA from an earlier species. Nor is it controversial that 13,000 years ago, long after humans in Europe had bred with the Neanderthals and the Neanderthals had died out, that people in West Africa were displaying some very primitive features in their anatomy, more in keeping with the archaic hominids with whom they maintained such a close relationship. In the description to this video, I give various links and references which viewers might find interesting.